are live. It is Tuesday, July 7th, 2020, a day that nobody celebrates. You don't ever hear about July 7th celebrations, do you? It is 5:00 p.m. It is swampy in Washington, and Kate has the monologue today.
So you did this beautiful monologue. I really loved it back when we first started doing the monologue, which I have to say was quite the improvement over Boris Johnson and
news,
murder hornet news. And then so Carrie, when this all started, we would just have we started measuring things in Boris Johnson news because Boris Johnson got COVID. And then we were like, what's going on with Boris Johnson? And then murder hornets descended on the US. And now basically we each just complain about our respective weathers. I am in the northeast-ish part, most northeast you can go in the United States, besides probably the very tip of Maine. And I am wearing a sweater. It is 60 something degrees here. It is what basically, I guess, November is like in the District of Columbia. And meanwhile, Ben is sweating constantly and complaining about how hot DC is. And I am dying for that kind of summer. And it just there is something that I have always, it makes me think about basically how much I have lived in the Northeast corridor my entire life, and I love seasons. And this entire pandemic, how we've measured time, the ways that we've constructed to measure time, all of these things, and the weather. And it occurs to me that I have never thought of myself as a type of person who could live somewhere even though they're lovely places like the Bahamas or Palm Springs or even San Francisco, because I really deeply don't know how I would organize my memories if I didn't have seasons. So I just have memories, and I'm wearing gloves and a hat, and it was cold out, and I remember when was the last time that I was wearing those types of clothes? Oh, we must have done that in December or something like that. Do you know what I mean? And so it's always been a question to me of when one lives in a place that doesn't have seasons, do you have different seasons? Is hurricane season an actual season that you measure or can feel, or or the monsoon season? Or is it kind of just the four seasons are a very unique thing to human history and kind of human experience? So anyways, that was what I was thinking about today.
While you were cool and not drenched in sweat, and
I'm sleeping with 3 blankets, Ben. I have 3 wool blankets on my bed.
Don't start with me, Clonic. All right, it is a great pleasure to introduce Carrie Johnson, with whom, as people who were here for the pregame show know, I was a cub reporter with at the late, great, now defunct newspaper Legal Times in the mid-1990s. I was 24 and Carrie was probably 22. We were insanely young. Carrie showed up as an intern. We ended up covering, it was a wild bunch of people. And I don't think I appreciated how kooky this group of people that we worked with was at the time. We'll talk a little bit about that. But Carrie showed up and has a funny origin story that we'll also go into. And we have been friends ever since. She was the Justice Department reporter at Legal Times after I left. And she came to the Washington Post, where she covered, the Enron task force and all the kind of criminal justice-y, complex federal investigations is kind of what I think of you having done at the Post. And then for the last, it's got to be 10 years now, right, Carrie?
10, believe it or not.
Carrie has been, her voice because you hear it in the morning when you're out for a run or commuting or, getting dressed. Carrie Johnson, voice of the Justice Department.
Most normal NPR byline I've ever heard in my entire life. Not normal, but just like kind of like yes, you know what I mean. They have the best bylines, but like the Carrie Johnson is like,
Carrie Johnson's like being talked to by Carrie Johnson. It's like, like having a conversation with Carrie, which is always a pleasure. So Carrie Johnson, welcome to In Lieu of Fun. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, it is a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's really good to see you again, if not in person, then this way, and to meet Kate formally at long last. After I think
this is what passes for in person now, Carrie.
Okay, it's all the same.
Two dimensions. It's all we got.
Okay.
I'm trying to pull up. Oh yeah. Ha 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 ha. Sorry, I just found all of my emails that Carrie was really nice to me from 2008.
You have your emails from 2008?
Hell yeah, I do. This is why I fight with the guys at
keeping them for your biography.
Life is long, Ben. Like I need dirt on everyone.
All right. So, Carrie, let's start way back with the hilarious story of how you came to Legal Times. As I recall, you showed up as an intern, having gone to a small college in the Midwest and then to like the University of Wisconsin at Madison to do like a master's, and you did your master's thesis on like being a court reporter, and then you wanted to try it, so you came to Legal Times. So am I getting all or some of that right?
That's exactly right. So I did my master's thesis by following around. At this era, there were 2 daily newspapers in Madison, Wisconsin, and I followed around the 2 reporters for the competing papers who covered the courts. And I did a very lengthy thesis on who talked to them and why, judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers, court apparatchiks, the whole 9 yards. And I determined that I thought I was too young to get my PhD and continue straight through. So I thought I would get some experience actually doing the job. So I showed up at Legal Times, where I promptly, I think, ran into Ben at the refrigerator and told him I had done this thesis. And he gave me a very funny look like, oh, are you going to be scrutinizing us? What are you doing? And in fact, I was extremely judgy. But now I know what I did not know then. So,
which was what?
Yeah, long and the short of it, I never went back to school and did my PhD, and now it seems like it's not.
We're all better for it.
Oh.
So, like when you showed up at Legal Times, you were what, like 22, 23?
I was 22 or 23. I was young, and I looked even younger, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we were all young. It's like Kate sometimes tells the story of this house that she lived in, which she calls the flop house, where she lived with all of these people who, Matt Iglesias and Ezra Klein, and it was kind of this
Spencer Ackerman,
this kind of like young people's who all ended up being something in journalism or life of letters. And I was thinking about, as she's talked about this, including when she and Matt Iglesias were talking about it on the show, what is the equivalent in my life to the flop house? And the answer is Legal Times, which was this collection of weird talent that was like either stuck at some point in their career at this trade newspaper or was beginning their careers like we were. And I don't think I had any idea at the time the group of people, like how talented the group of people that we were with in that. So like there was you, there was Danny Kleidman, and who's, you know, gone on to, he runs Yahoo News now, but he's been a very celebrated investigative reporter. People like Eva Rodriguez and Naftali Ben David and Tom Watson and Stuart Taylor. I mean, it was a kind of amazing group of people, and Deirdre Shesgreen, and we were all just like packed into this dingy little room putting out this like weekly newspaper. Did you have any idea that the people that you were working with were exceptional? Because I sure didn't.
I did have a sense that because the economy was so terrible then, that people like Eva Rodriguez and Naftali Ben David were stuck temporarily at Legal Times. After a point, they might have wished they had left. But I did not realize, Ben, how much of a lodestar that experience would be for me to this day, and how many of the, I'm just going to throw it out there, values that I have emanated from that place. And I still believe that all these years later, more than 25 years now.
Yeah, I am totally with you about that. I think about there are these times in my career where I've had like questions about like kind of what's the right thing to do. And one of my reference points for that is like, if we sat around at Legal Times and chatted this one out, what would we conclude? And I am, you know, sort of amazed by how good that group of people was, and how influential on me they were. And they kind of all went on to great things. Like, and most of them like are not in touch with one another anymore, but I still remember like where everybody sat, and, you know, and kind of like what we would have these Thursday night dinners, because the paper kind of, we went to bed on Friday, and so Thursday was kind of crunch day, and we would always order in, and people would sit in kind of the same place every day around this, every week around this communal table, and kind of where, like which direction you would look to see whom, is still deeply kind of imprinted in my brain.
Not to mention the table manners, some of which could have used a lot of improvement in my opinion.
Yes. Well, like as a general matter, it was a kind of a raunchy and inappropriate environment, among other things.
I just want to say that I was one, like no one has it up on like, there was one, I will not even say which school it was because it's so bad, but there was a time when I was in graduate school when I was at a small lunch meeting with a bunch of people, including a lot of like professors who were much more prestigious than I was. And I watched a very prestigious person, very great bylines, all this like kind of stuff, literally just eat fistfuls of chicken salad with his hands.
That's awesome.
And I will never unsee it as long as I live. It's like, I just like, I wish I could, but it was awful. So I'm sure that you guys looked great in comparison.
I don't know. I can't remember if the show Seinfeld was on at that time, but there was a lot of double dipping behavior going on at the communal table. A lot of double dipping. And then there was also, you know, a semi-formal contest to see how often you could get Elvis Costello or Bob Dylan into the headlines or cut lines of the paper, captions, whatever. And you got like an extra special bonus for that.
Now, and there was one of the things that was odd about Legal Times, and I'm going to call out the person who was responsible for this. I believe that this game was the creation of Tom Watson, who went on to be national editor of Newsweek. So like a serious person. But so Legal Times had a ceiling that was reasonably low, and it had these partitions that went up relatively high, higher than most newsrooms. And so there was a relatively small gap between the top of the partitions and the ceilings. And there was this beanbag penguin that Tom had in his office. And sometimes when things would get, I don't know, punchy, he would play this game to try to throw the penguin across the newsroom, getting it as many spaces in between the tops of the partitions and the ceiling as possible. And the idea was to hit the wall on the other side of the newsroom. But of course, most times you can't do that because throws go on an arc, right? And so it would either hit the ceiling or it would dip down. And so it was actually very difficult. And I tried it many times. And normally the penguin would fall on the head of a reporter who was actually trying to do work. And so, Carrie, how many times were you hit on the head by a penguin?
Almost never, which is good because, as you know, I get a little hot tempered. But I remember you getting hit a lot because you had an unfortunate seat on the aisle, and the arc of the penguin, if it went awry, would bang you in the head.
Yes, it would hit me or Naftali or Sam Skolnick, and we got hit a lot. But we also played the game, and so we didn't really get to complain about it. But it was, like if you were on the phone with like a senior Justice Department official and all of a sudden, thunk, you're hit on the head with a beanbag penguin. It was this sort of weird, like mashing of, you're like a 24-year-old reporter and you're on the phone with the Deputy Attorney General. It's like you've got this heady thing going on, and it's like, wow, I'm important, right? And then you get hit with a beanbag. And so there's this, yeah, exactly. And so there was this kind of like nice mixing of the sublime and the ridiculous. All right, enough nostalgia.
I was going to ask, do you guys,
Go ahead, Jake.
do you know, like, do you remember like there was that period in time in which, like, I think it was like 2008 to 2009, maybe 2007, the Washington Independent and like all of that, like that series of online papers that tried to start kind of like hometown newspapers, laid off hometown newspapers. They were in Minnesota and Iowa, and they actually specialized basically like on supporting local newspapers with kind of in areas that the primaries reached first, because they'd like have all of this other coverage in place for those. But anyways, Laura McGann, who's now at Politico and has been there for a long time, and Spencer Ackerman and Dave Weigel all were at the Washington Independent in that time. And I just always look back at that and think that was kind of a little bit like Legal Times. Like it was like a kind of a really, really smart group of people that were all writing at the same time. But Ben, to your point, do you really think that like you didn't realize everyone was a genius? Or do you think actually, to turn it on its head, that like maybe that's what growing up and kind of coming into a field and building a career is all about? Like it all is just all of us doing whatever. And as Carrie said, not knowing how much you don't know. And then slowly over time, that changes and you become the expert.
I think there's a fair bit of that. There's the sort of formative professional environments in which you grow up, and you always reminisce back about them with some combination of horror and nostalgia. I also think the group of people we worked with at Legal Times was exceptional, and that was a remarkable collection of talent that just kind of landed in that place at the same time. I mean, when Carrie and I were there, the editor was a guy named Eric Efron, whose predecessor in that job editing this tiny little trade newspaper was Jill Abramson, who went on to run the New York Times, and
fair.
I mean,
you got me.
Like it was a genuinely exceptional group of people, and and I grew up professionally expecting that a little newspaper like that would break news all the time, because we did, and that's
super cool.
I think it was formative for me in what a small group of people who were dedicated and serious and kind of have a sense of mission and purpose can do. Do you agree with that, Carrie?
Yeah, I'll never forget that Tom Watson used to go around the newsroom hollering, "It's legal times, it's who we are, it's what we do." And it was. It was, to this day, as you know, Ben, I'm in a book club with most of the people came from Legal Times 20 plus years ago. And when I was doing a fellowship in Cambridge last year, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, several of them from Legal Times came out to visit. So we're still very tight in a good way.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's super cool.
I will say about Tom Watson, who went on to be national editor of Newsweek, and I would sometimes call him back when I was at the Post and he was at Newsweek and ask him, "How are you doing?" And he would say in this confused sort of way, as though he were watching his life happen to somebody else, "I appear to be national editor of Newsweek," as though this was a sort of out of body experience for him. And I think like in his soul, he is the executive editor of Legal Times, this sort of like plucky bunch of people in this ratty office. And I think like part of me and my soul is like a 23-year-old reporter in that environment. So, God bless. But now, Carrie, you are the esteemed Justice Department reporter of National Public Radio. And so I want to ask an embarrassing question, which is, how did you learn to sound like Carrie Johnson on the radio?
I was going to ask that same question, Ben.
Really?
That was my question. Yeah, I was going to be like, how, because I think that's so cool that you transition from like, I mean, obviously still write print, but like that you transition. That's so cool.
It was really hard for me. I didn't realize how hard it was going to be. I started writing for newspapers for money when I was 13 or 14 years old, writing sports for my local paper in suburban Chicago. And I didn't realize writing for radio was as different as it is. And I wasn't sure how to be myself on the radio. So with the help of a number of mentors, including a guy named Paul Brown, who's now retired and is a bluegrass musician in North Carolina, but used to be an NPR newscaster, and a brilliant gentleman named David Candow, who had been a pioneer at Canadian broadcasting and also trained a lot of NPR people. I figured out how to do it. Some days are still better than others, but
but I'm curious, like, what's the difference? What were you, when you showed up at NPR, like, what did you do that you now think like, wow, I can't believe I did that? Like, what's the difference between writing a news story and writing and performing? Because some of it is a performance, news copy on the radio.
Well, you have to write for your breath, and it's a physical thing, and it takes a long time to learn how to write for your breath. And I know.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that you only have so much air that you can get out before taking a breath. So your sentences ought to be pretty short, unless you're a genius like Ari Shapiro, and you can just talk and 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 talk without taking a breath. So
I think that I write how I speak. I think that I've always kind of written how I speak.
And that's what you need to do on the radio. But what it looks like on the page is, like half a line, and then another half a line, and then another half a line. And that's how you have to do it. So like all this writing with jargon and clauses, and it just, I have to beat that out of myself and out of the lawyers I want to quote on the radio too, because they talk too long.
I get screened a lot for this when I do radio. And I think that I have just basically, like, through trial and error, figured out that I say something slightly pithy, make some metaphor that's like slightly slightly kind of funny, or like kind of they haven't heard before. And then they're like charmed and want to have me on. But basically, like, it's just like, they don't want to get someone on that's super boring and they can't break up the pattern. And I kind of get it. Like, it's really hard to break up that, like, the kind of the diatribe that we can go on as lawyers to like describe everything in great detail. See, I just did it.
Carrie, you've done this for years now. Which kind of writing do you prefer? Are you a convert to writing these very clipped sentences that can be defined by a breath, or do you miss writing in more less orally and more on the page expressive prose?
So this is the difference. I mean, we talked about starting out at a weekly newspaper. Who even has those anymore, right? The business has become a business where you have to do everything. So you do podcasts, you do Zoom shows, Ben, you're a contributor on a television network, and you do a lot of writing on your site and at Brookings. And so I think everybody in the news business now has to be able to do all of those things. And the trick is to figure out which kind of story is best told in which medium. So for instance, I've been doing some stories recently since I've been back on a case in New York, a federal prosecution that blew up and the government is trying to abandon it. That's really hard to do on the radio because you can't get the defendant to talk. The prosecution doesn't want to talk. There's no tape. There's no humanity. There's no voices. So I do a lot of that for the NPR website. But when I do stories about people who are in prison for life for drug crimes, those are stories where I really want to get the voices of people. I want to go to the house of their family who's outside prison and record their kids and try to get the judge. I think the story helps to determine the media. And I really love being able to type for a living and talk for a living. And some people just take information easier through the ear. And so I want to talk to them and tell them stories in a way that I can reach them.
Yeah, I think that there's a huge amount of impact. It's funny that we thought that there was this period in which, like, when I was growing up, like, people were like, radio is dead, like radio, like, video killed the radio star type of, like, stuff. And podcasts have just surged. So it just obviously, I mean, like, what was, Ben, that funny video that you put up about, like, don't start your own podcast, whatever you do in the pandemic, don't start your own podcast.
The greatest thing you can do is shut the fuck up.
Yes. Yeah. It was speaking directly to Ben and I. This is not a podcast. So people like say that all the time. They're like, we'll come on your podcast. And I'm like, it's not a podcast. But that said, I do think that you bring up a really great point, which is just kind of like, it's a really amazing way to reach people. When you commute, if you have like a very active brain, having a podcast or something to listen to is just, I don't know how you make use of that time. Otherwise, it feels like it's just this huge waste. So podcasts have been amazing. I'm very curious, have you ever thought about kind of, do you like the life of being a reporter? Do you like it seems like you like your new life of being on radio, but do you ever think about kind of you and Dahlia Lithwick could be like sisters, and you could bring in you could just start this whole DOJ SCOTUS incredible podcast empire. Sorry, maybe I'm projecting my dreams for you. I'm just
Carrie's got your future career all mapped out for you, Carrie.
Wow.
I know.
I think Dahlia's doing just fine. She doesn't need dead weight like me, but
no, shut up. Yeah. You, Emily Bazelon, oh my gosh, and Leah Littman. You could bring in the juniors, and then you could have. Okay, so anyways, there's just this really great kind of stuff that's happening right now, and I'm curious. So many women are doing this. You are this veteran. Is it fun to kind of watch people come into this space? Are you still enjoying it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I do fairly often the NPR Politics podcast, which I love, because you don't have to be so serious. You don't have to be so serious all the time. Exactly.
Yeah, we're so serious.
You too. You're like, bring a drink. You, Ben, you told me preparation was antithetical to this show.
Yes.
It is true. We don't prep anyone.
There is a rule on the show that we only plan the show on the show.
Okay, so I love it.
We do a daily show. It's a lot of time.
other than a general admonition, we'd probably gossip about legal times. I didn't tell you anything about what we were going to talk about, right?
Exactly.
Because I didn't know.
But like,
we're on the high wire, and it's all good. We're not going to fall off. Yeah.
So now you're a radio reporter. You were like a print reporter. You know, all of these, I think that the space has changed so much. My heroes, when I was talking to you and you were helping me through like being a child on the internet, was you and Dahlia and I don't know if Emily really had a voice at that point, but no, I'm curious, like, is it fun to kind of see a space populated by like younger female voices and like new people? I mean, is there a camaraderie between you and some of like the people who've been writing about kind of some of these issues for like a long time?
Yeah, I'm on the DOJ beat. There are people I knew, have known for a long time. There are older people, and now increasingly there are lots of younger people. And there used to be, in the day when there used to be criminal trials, I used to love to go around the country, as Ben said, and cover them. And to some extent, with the Mueller investigation, there were a few criminal trials. And so hanging around with that bunch is incredible. In fact, I bought a court sketch from the courtroom artist Bill Hennessy last year of the Paul Manafort trial, because in the audience was an entire row of women reporters. And I had never seen that before in my career.
What a cool story.
Yeah.
That's
and
so cool.
I really wanted to have that because several of my friends are in that row with me. And now there are a bunch of us, which is really great. Really great. I love it.
Rachel Coit, the floor is yours.
Hi. So In Lieu of Fun is totally unprepped and unscripted, but I assume that some NPR interviews, there's maybe like some scripting or some prep. So what does that look like? How much do they know about what you're going to ask them before you interview them?
So for people who don't work in NPR, who are interviewed by the hosts, almost always those people are pre-interviewed by a producer. So the producer screens for whether people are pithy, whether they have knowledge, whether they have lots of good examples. And so the producer will take notes and then pass them to the host. But in most situations, those people who are interviewed on the air don't get the questions in advance. If you work in NPR, you try to tap out an arc of the conversation that you and the host will have. But the host can and often does extemporize and improvise. So you better roll with it. And if it's 5 o'clock in the morning, you better be awake and roll with it if they go in a different direction. The main thing that I have found that's challenging going from being interviewed on the radio to working on the radio is if you work at NPR, you are responsible for monitoring the clock. So you better not start a thought with 20 seconds left in the segment, because you're going to wind up looking like an idiot. Whereas if you're interviewed on NPR and you're a law professor or a scholar of some sort, they'll give you a little warning and then they'll cut you off, but you won't look idiotic if you're still talking and the host steps on you and says, it's time to go. And you do not want to be the person who, it's called breaking the segment. You do not want to jam up the show and ruin the clock. It's a bad thing to do.
So but my experience on NPR is that there are some oddities of when you're being interviewed for a show, for a spot, rather than in a live setting. You will often be asked the question 2 or 3 times, because not only is the reporter trying to get the substantive answer to your question, as any reporter for a serious news outlet would do, but they're trying to get you to answer it in a way that makes for good radio copy. And so, I've often had conversations with you where you'll ask me a question and I'll sort of extemporate about it. And then you'll say, can you figure out a way to say that again in 2 sentences? And it's actually like a super hard, because what you're looking for is the 30 seconds of of clip that you can then work into a story that distills maybe 5 minutes of conversation.
Not even 30 seconds. It would be remarkable if somebody got 30 seconds who was not the president or the Pope. And that's about it. Otherwise, you're not getting 30 seconds uninterrupted. You're getting maximum 22 or 24 seconds. So if you're
I did 9 hours of interview for Radiolab. 9 hours in studio. I freaking trekked into Manhattan to do, and I love Simon Adler. He's great. And I love Jad. He was really wonderful. They were great, but I did 9 hours and it was like 6 minutes, 7 minutes. And that was a ton of audio for an hour of me talking. That was crazy. So, but it was just like, no one has any idea what that's like.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah.
The other interesting oddity of the pre-interview thing on NPR, which networks do too, but is how unconnected those will sometimes be from the actual conversation. And the pre-interviewer asks about a whole lot of things in order to give the person who's actually going to do the live segment a sense of options, but you still walk into that interview not knowing what you're going to be asked, just sort of a sense of topic.
Yes, and that's why sometimes doing live television with a network you're not familiar with and a host you're not familiar with can actually kind of be a little dangerous sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's totally healthy. I think there's, if people want to go on the radio, they should be comfortable enough in their skin to talk about the issues that they're supposedly expert on with a certain fluidity and, ability to roll with the punches. And I think the sense of entitlement of guests to know precisely what they're going to be asked and be able to formulate things in advance and then kind of essentially read off a mental script that they've written in their heads, it's totally unreasonable. I think it's like fine for people to be expected to know the subject well enough to be a little bit extemporaneous.
Oh, I don't disagree with that at all. I'm more thinking of the context where you might be doing a television program at night with a host or a co-panelist who is partisan in some way or political in some way. And as a reporter, I'm a reporter. I'm not an opinion person. I'm not a columnist. That can be problematic, very problematic.
Yes, I agree with that. And look, sometimes hosts will intentionally put you in a difficult position. During the period in which I did a lot of speaking, including on television, about, things that Jim Comey had told me while he was in office. I had one interaction with on live television in which a prominent television host asked me, what is Comey telling you these days? And I was completely flummoxed by it. And I just said, I would never answer that question. And then rather to my surprise, he just said, why not? And I was very surprised by it. And I never watched how I handled it, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some,
did you drool then?
I think I may. I expressed my displeasure to the producer, but look, I mean, when you're on television, they can put you in some pretty difficult positions, including when you're a reporter who's not supposed to express your opinions by surrounding you with opinionated assholes like me.
So I'm very curious to know, Carrie, so we're kind of talking about this, you've been on this beat for most of your career, you are the expert in this area. We had Larry Lessig on a couple of weeks ago, and we've had a bunch of kind of academics on, and as an academic now, I realize that like I have this great kind of arc of my research that can go like this, and like Larry's has definitely gone like this. And like there's, you know, I was actually, yeah. But anyways, I was just wondering, like, do you get tired of the DOJ beat? Do you get tired of it? Or do you, is it like, it was actually funny because when I looked up our emails, we were about Mukasey and the Ted Stevens trial and Sarah Palin. And so that was what our entire, like, it was all about the IG report that had come down in the summer of 2008. And then it was Sarah Palin. And then it was all about Mukasey. And there was like, and I was just thinking about like, well, I would get sick of covering the DOJ if I was Carrie. And then I was like, wow, Mukasey was a different person to cover than like Barr or Holder or who, you know, like they're all so different. And so I'm wondering, like, maybe that shakes it up.
Yeah, you know, it hasn't been boring. I don't think it's ever been boring. There was one stretch in the middle of the Obama administration where I was a little bored, and I went out into the country, and NPR let me do this and interview lots of people for a series I did on mandatory minimum sentences. And I got to go to meet a whole bunch of people in prison and their families and judges and really amazing folks. And so that's something that I've been unable to do really in the last 3 or 4 years, because every day brings something new at the Trump Justice Department. Every day, and sometimes multiple times a day. So it's really not boring ever. Would I like more time sometimes to think about deeper and richer coverage? Yes, and I do get that. I'm just returning, as I mentioned, from a 10-month fellowship. So I've been very lucky to think.
So you're up in Boston? Tell us about that. What were you doing and spending time thinking about?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to do what's called a Neiman Fellowship with 26 reporters.
The Neiman Institute is incredible. Yeah, it's such a cool organization. Congratulations. That's a great, like, they got lucky to have you too as a fellow.
I don't know about that. My fellows are from all over the world and extraordinary people, some of whom had been threatened, surveilled, beaten up for their coverage around the world. So, you know, listen, covering the Justice Department is easy street compared to what some of those people have endured. I thought a lot about, I thought a lot about race and inequality in the last 10 months. And then I struggled in returning to NPR, how to make that a stream of my coverage. And unfortunately, in the period in which, in between when my fellowship ended and when I returned to work, we had a number of killings by police of Black people. And all of a sudden, all of the things I had read and studied and thought about became very real on the street corner where I live and down the block in Black Lives Matter Plaza. So it's a strange thing. I'm grateful to have had that time and done that thinking and reading.
Dan Strum, the floor is yours.
Hello. I've been following your podcasts and Twitters for a while. When I saw that Carrie was coming on, I realized I had a chance to ask people with great expertise in journalism and law a question about the First Amendment. There's so much disinformation going on in our nation, and I wonder how journalism can deal with it, or more importantly, how politics can deal with it. Can you envision any kind of policy solution that would ensure that Americans across the board got access to verified information, which wouldn't infringe with the First Amendment? Would you support such a thing? And importantly, how might it backfire? Because I'm sure it could.
Great question. And you have 3 people on this panel with wildly different backgrounds and instincts for purposes of answering it. And experiences. In some ways, the person who has worked this question the hardest is Kate. But Carrie, let's start with you. What are your thoughts? How can you control disinformation in a fashion consistent with the First Amendment?
Yes, this is a struggle. I'm mostly going to defer to Kate, but I'll talk briefly about NPR and other news organizations have a partnership with something called the News Literacy Project that tries to help educate people about news sources they can trust. And I've got to tell you that over the years, I don't know how many mass shootings I have covered. I don't cover them very often anymore, but dozens. And a whole lot of bad information gets out there and sometimes gets reported on the air and in the newspaper and on websites. And that is terrible. And we have procedures to check against that. But more concerning is the idea that people are actually trying to tamper with the reporting process and actively spread bad information and conspiracy theories that can have a lot of real world effects, both in terms of struggles between people and law enforcement and election security and a whole bunch of other contexts. So I worry about this. I worry about this in my own family and with my own family members. And I spend a lot of time with them. But I have not thought about a policy solution. I know that Kate has done a lot of writing about this.
Kate,
yeah, just, I guess.
yeah,
Okay.
your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, Dan, it's a great question, but the first question is kind of like where the First Amendment comes in. It would come in if the government decided to be the source of forcing private companies or private individuals to mandate some type of speech based around truth or some type of reporting based around truth. And right now we have a lot of freedom in that from journalistic organizations that are unconstrained by First Amendment. So it would be hard to, you could always pass the law. As I like to tell reporters, you can always pass the law. It's not illegal. It's I love that question. Is this illegal? I'm I don't know. It's not, it hasn't been litigated yet. It's a bill. So but it would go against a lot of things that, and presumably not actually be a legal thing that you could do. But that being said, I think the question you're kind of getting at is one that we're all asking ourselves, which is how do you deal with the fact that there is so much mis and disinformation on the internet, that journalists are kind of being hounded for being biased or being kind of not telling the whole story, and you have all of these kind of different types of publications. I would say that that's to a certain extent always happened. We've always had publications on the left and the right that have covered different things. It's a little bit more extreme right now, and it's amplified by the internet in a really bad way. And I would just say that my general takeaway is that I caution against the idea of individuals, how do I put this? Not individuals, but platforms like Facebook or Twitter or any of these kind of social media companies starting to define truth. These fact-checking panels that Facebook put into effect, those are kind of a little bit crazy, because you could post something for satire that looks like real news to someone else, and all of these things kind of end up bleeding into each other. So for example, one of the classic, I think a classic example is when the Nancy Pelosi video happened, there was no way of discerning whether that was actually satire. What if someone had done that to satirize her or to make fun of her or to make political commentary? It was a dissident opinion, for example. Then to just completely censor it because it's fake news, because it takes in a life of its own. This is just kind of a broader question about how we're talking about communication and what we're trying to communicate, and how people suss out the underlying facts of things. So anyway, this is not no one likes this answer, by the way, because it's just oh, think harder. But it's true. Think harder and go more towards kind of more diverse resources and Google things you see. And if something makes you there is I have to say, maybe it's just me, but I'm a little bit trained, but Ben, you have to Carrie, you can tell me if I'm wrong. Don't you have a instinct about a lot of stuff on the internet? Something pops up and just what are the motives? Why am I seeing this?
I was actually going to focus on that point, because I think I don't think the solution here is a policy solution. First of all,
No, it's not.
Disinformation and foreign sponsored disinformation is really old. The Soviet Union used to fund and sponsor a daily newspaper in the United States called the Daily Worker, which was run by the Communist Party USA. And, you know, the immunities that the US population had against Soviet propaganda was such that the Daily Worker never meaningfully competed with the New York Times, right? We had the problem was not to suppress, the solution was not to suppress the Daily Worker or anything that stressed the First Amendment. It was to tolerate it and, you know, let people, you know, let the immunities of the society operate against the information or misinformation or disinformation that the Soviets wanted to propagate. The problem right now is that people disproportionately above a certain age, but not only above a certain age, do not have a certain set of immunities that Kate is describing, that when something pops up on your screen, you say, I wonder if this is bullshit. And I wonder if this is bullshit of a sort that is being fed to me because of some either algorithmic reason or some active kind of, you know, what Tom Rid would call some active measure, right? And that is a really important set of immunities to develop. And by the way, I think we will develop them naturally over time, but we need a sort of die off of a certain generation. And we need a certain other group of people to really educate themselves about how information flows. And we need a younger generation that is digitally native to come in with the savvy that they bring to information more generally. And I think all of those are going to be the much more serious. And of course, there are platform policies that will be very meaningful here, but I'm not sure there's a lot of federal national policy that will.
I think that's completely right. I want to pose a question, Ben and Carrie. Do you guys think, I've thought of myself as a bridge generation? I remember papers being delivered and AOL CDs coming in the mail. But I actually
Carrie
wonder,
and I are the bridge generation.
But I was just going to say that was exactly what I was thinking after you kind of just said what you said, Ben. Carrie, do you agree with that? Do you feel like you're kind of a bridge generation?
I'm going to prove to you that Carrie and not you is the real bridge generation. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Carrie, your first papers in college, how did you produce them?
Typewriter, word processor, and then by the end of college, the computer lab in college.
Right.
Like punch cards?
And when you say
not
word
punch
processor,
cards. I know, but like you said typewriter, Carrie.
Yeah,
so like I didn't know.
That's right. When Carrie went to school, when I went to school, we brought typewriters to college. Right?
No. No, yeah. Did
Yes,
you really? So, but
absolutely.
Like,
but wait.
What
I'm gonna blow your mind again, Kate. Carrie, when you say word processor, what do you mean?
It was like I had to borrow it from somebody in my dorm. But it wasn't a computer yet. It was like a revved up typewriter that had some capacity. I don't even know how to describe it. Well, it looked like a typewriter mostly, right?
It was a typewriter with a little screen, and and it had some memory, and you type things in, and you could correct it, and then at the end you hit print, and it spat it out.
Yeah, no, but with the printer that did the dots.
Right, it was a dot matrix printer,
and you had the sides you had to tear off. See, I remember that, Ben.
Okay, so here's the next question, Carrie. What was your first? When in your life did you first acquire an email address and then not lose it at some point?
I think grad school, but I'm not sure. Late college or early grad school.
This is a great question.
See,
Ben, what's
me,
your answer?
Well, for me, I mean, I had an email address when I was at college, but then when I left college, I lost it and I did not have another email
When were you
address.
at college? What years?
I graduated in 1990, and then I
Okay.
did not have a permanent email address again until Legal Times got email. And since then, I have had continuous email through work and now, of course, through Google and the way everybody gets email. But like, it was not until probably 93 or 94 that like we all, like Carrie and I are part of the generation that went to college with typewriters and left with computer literacy. Like, I think we're much more of a bridge than you guys are.
You might be. I mean, my first computer experience was in like 3rd or 4th grade doing Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing in 3rd or 4th grade, which, to be clear, is like maybe one of the best things that was ever taught to me. So my mom knows how to type. My dad does not know how to type. They are different levels of like what, like my mom is a Supreme Court judge in New York State and she did all this like typing by her, like, but she had to learn that because she was a woman and they like just taught you how to be a secretary, basically, like was how to type. And my dad just like never learned that. That was just never something. But he's actually so much worse off for it. Like he doesn't write anything. He can't, like, he has to like henpeck out. He can't he can't write anything. It's really kind of crazy. So this is so, well, I don't want to go down a tangent because we have to end soon, but I was going to say that like, this is kind of fascinating because I do think that there is a huge amount of, I do think that there's a huge amount of kind of like divergence, like typewriter versus personal computer is huge, but I do think that the internet access was huge. Dial up turning into cable was enormous. It changed everything. The birth of smartphones changed everything. Like that really changed so much. Like being able to take pictures and send them constantly, unlimited data plans, like those types of things, like just completely blew up the entire amount that people were sharing all the time and willing to share. So
here's another closing technology question for Carrie. There was a time, and I remember it, one of your predecessors as Justice Department reporter at NPR, Chitra Raghavan. I remember going to a hearing and all the reporters are there with their, pads of paper and their pens, and some of them have a little, mini digital recorder or a tape recorder. And Chitra walks in with this significant microphone and this pretty substantial recording rig, right? And there are like basically the NPR reporter is the only person in the room with significant audio capacity. And now we're all walking around with that recording rig on our phones. And, the voice memo function on the iPhone is not 100% of what Chitra was carrying that day, but it's 75% of it. Yeah. How much is being a radio reporter still really different from all the other kinds of reporting that goes on, given the technological advances that have put the audio capacity in everybody's pocket?
So thank goodness for that, Ben, because I can't imagine a mostly work from home situation without the easy ability of people to record themselves and send me that tape. It's been life-changing for the last 3 weeks since I've been back at work. That said, there are some things that radio native reporters or radio trained reporters are going to do better. That includes catching a lot of ambient sound, knowing how to ask questions so people answer in a pithy and interesting way, and basically knowing how to talk in a way that people are going to want to listen. So some print reporters know how to do that and television reporters know how to do that and some don't. And it's just a matter of doing it a lot and being edited a lot and working with reporters, radio reporters who really know what they're doing. The other thing I would say is that really good radio reporters don't talk a lot. They listen more than they talk. They don't interrupt people when they're talking. And they start recording as soon as they enter a room, and they don't stop recording until they've left the room, because you never know what someone's going to blurt out right at the end.
You know, that's your point. The point that you started with hits home really hard. When I started the Lawfare podcast, I realized quickly that I was just talking way too much and, you know, was not formulating questions crisply enough, or was doing it in this way that required too much setup, and learning to direct and to get people talking, but to do it without a lot of talking yourself was really hard. And I still struggle with it.
Well, as you have pointed out to me for the last 25 years, it helps if you make a lot of faces instead of talking. So
Like this?
I do that a lot. I'm like, I make faces all the time. Like,
yeah,
like, yeah.
that's what I do when somebody in the government is lying to me. Like, are you seriously?
Grimace face.
Show up. Yeah, the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I look like an emoji. I just like shrink my entire face into my neck. It's great. Carrie, this has been so much fun. I want to hang out with you all the time. Like, I'm curious, and I don't want to be nosy. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but I love the beautiful pictures behind you.
Oh,
they look really sweet. And I was kind of curious, just like what they were, if you wanted to talk about them.
yeah. These are both sets of my grandparents.
Oh, cool.
My dad's parents, when my grandfather was in World War II. And my grandmother here, Ruth, is still around, bless her heart, 94. And these are my mom's parents. I grew up mostly in their house, and they're both dead now. But I love having them both side by side in my house looking snazzy.
No, it's a
They're
very
great
sweet set of,
pictures.
yeah, there's a very sweet set of, like, you have I give you a 10 out of 10 on the room reader.
Oh, thank
Ben
you.
gets it. Ben has a 0 out of 10, just to kind of put that in perspective.
I got a 0 out of 10 on Room Raider.
You did?
Yeah,
You're
He's really proud of it.
not for this.
Uh-oh.
No, it was when I got a 0 out of 10, it was just like me and Mitch McConnell had 0s out of 10. And mine said, it was just a blue wall in back of me, and it just said blue hostage video, 0 out of 10. And
It's a hostage video.
blue
That's
hostage
hilarious.
video. And I'm very proud of the 0 out of 10 on Room Raider. And then I was on Morning Joe the next day, and Scarborough made fun of me about it. It was great. I'm very proud.
Yeah.
Carrie, it's been great to see you. Welcome back to Washington. Not that that means we're any more likely to get together, given the times we live in, but it's good to have you back in the vicinity anyway. And let's do this again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to reconnect with both of you.
So tomorrow
you're the
we
best.
have probable Supreme Court action. So we are going to
Wait, tomorrow
leave-
on a Wednesday? Wait, what's going on?
I believe it's Wednesday. I believe Wednesday's a decision day this week. Is that right, Carrie?
Yeah,
Oh.
10 a.m.
Is that because
Yes.
of July 4th? I don't
Oh,
know,
they're
whatever.
just announcing it
Whatever.
week by week.
Okay,
right
whatever. Okay, so
now. Tomorrow's a decision day.
SCOTUS. Okay.
So we may have some religious freedom cases. We may have a little bit of Mazars. We may have all kinds of stuff. So we're going to leave
Okay.
tomorrow open. We'll figure it out in the morning. There'll be no planning. There'll be no scripting. We may not even have read the opinions like yesterday.
I
We'll
read
do
it.
You read it?
Yes. I said that
Oh.
yesterday.
Kate may
But-
have read the opinion and I not, like yesterday. But until then,
We don't have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, we reminisce about penguins falling from the ceiling. I kind of loved that beanbag story. I loved it.
maybe we should have Tom Watson on to talk
That would be
about
great.
throwing penguins.
Absolutely. I endorse that idea.
Tom Watson, I haven't spoken to Tom Watson in years. I have no idea what he's up to. And I think bringing him back on in lieu of fun to talk about throwing penguins is probably an idea whose time has come. Carrie, will you join us for an interrogation of Tom?
Yes. I
Oh,
have
please
many
come back.
questions to ask Tom. I saw Tom maybe a year and a half ago in New York, and I would love to ask him questions about his editorial process.
All right, we're going to do that. Tweet at him right now and challenge him to come on in lieu of fun and talk penguin throwing. Until then, see you later.
Bye.